there, my Twilight Souls. Tonight, we follow Edward Cullen's most terrifying moments through Midnight Sun. A century-old vampire's war against his own monstrous nature, where loving Bella Swan meant resisting the bloodlust that could destroy her in seconds. Edward's terror is unique. His telepathy forces him to experience everyone's fear, while his own self-hatred whispers that beneath centuries of control lives the monster he's always been. So, I'd like to ask something of you folks. Please consider subscribing to help me reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Crafting these theories requires deep research and careful dedication, and your support would mean more than I can express. Thank you. As you settle in, I'm curious where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You can tell me in the comments. Alright, let's get cozy now. Close your eyes, breathe in very slowly, and let Edward's darkest moments and his fierce protection carry you gently into rest. Edward Anthony Mason Cullen had existed for 92 years before January 18 of 2005. His vampire life being characterized by perfect control and by superiority complex that came from centuries of successfully resisting human blood. Despite his nature being designed specifically for human predation, his vegetarian lifestyle alongside Carlisle's family, creating sense of moral achievement that separated him from typical vampires whose existence was defined by killing, and whose philosophy accepted murder as natural expression of their superior position in food chain. His routine at Forks High School was tedium incarnate. The repetition of curriculum he had mastered decades earlier, and the shallow thoughts of teenagers whose mental voices he heard constantly creating boredom that made immortality feel like punishment rather than gift. His perfect recall and his supernatural intelligence making human education beneath notice except as cover story that allowed family to maintain human facade and allowed them to exist in community without arousing suspicion about their true nature. The morning of January 18th began like every morning before it. His drive to school with his siblings following familiar pattern, and his entrance into biology class representing just another hour of tedious waiting, while Mr. Banner discussed cellular structures that Edward understood more completely than teacher, whose education was limited by human lifetime of learning compared to Edward's decades of accumulated knowledge. His assigned seat at blacktop lab table was positioned near windows, the partner seat beside him remaining empty for weeks since previous occupant had moved away. His solitary position at table being preferable to forced proximity with human, whose thoughts he would hear and whose scent would test his control even minimally when sitting 18 inches away created intimacy that strangers should not share, but that classroom seating arrangements imposed without consideration for vampire whose senses made proximity to humans constant exercise and restraint. The door opening to admit late arrival registered peripherally in Edward's awareness, his attention being focused on Alice's recent vision of snow arriving by weekend and on Emmett's thoughts about challenging him to hunting trip in the Olympic Mountains. But the sudden shift in air current as fan positioned near doorway caught new student's scent and blew it directly across classroom toward Edward's position, created instantaneous physical response that transcended thought and transcended century of carefully constructed discipline that had defined his vampire existence since Carlyle had taught him alternative to human hunting, that typical vampires considered natural and considered their right as apex predators. The scent hit him like physical force, like wall of flame that consumed oxygen and consumed rational thought. The burning in his throat intensifying from usual background awareness of human blood to inferno that demanded immediate satisfaction and that activated hunting instincts he had spent 90 years suppressing through constant vigilance and through constant choice to value human life over his own comfort. His body responded before his mind could engage conscious control, his muscles tensing for attack and his venom pooling in his mouth in preparation for bite that would pierce human skin and would allow him to drain blood whose scent promised satisfaction beyond anything he had experienced across century of animal hunting, that provided sustenance but provided no pleasure and provided no relief from burning thirst that defined vampire existence regardless of dietary philosophy. The girl whose scent had triggered this catastrophic response was ordinary human teenager whose appearance registered in Edward's peripheral vision as brown hair and pale skin and brown eyes that suggested nothing remarkable and nothing that would explain why her blood called to him with intensity that transcended normal human appeal and that transcended every other human he had encountered across 92 years of carefully maintained vegetarian discipline. Her assignment to seat beside him represented disaster of cosmic proportions. The teacher's casual direction that she take empty chair creating situation where Edward would sit 18 inches from source of most appealing blood he had ever scented, and where he would endure this proximity for 55 minutes of class period, during which his control would be tested beyond anything he had experienced, and during which murder was not abstract possibility, but was active temptation requiring every second of his concentration to resist. His telepathic awareness expanded to assess situation and assess obstacles to feeding, that his instincts were demanding he satisfy immediately regardless of consequences and regardless of century of choices that would be destroyed by a single moment of weakness. 23 humans occupied biology classroom, including Bella Swan, whose name he extracted from Mr. Banner's thoughts, along with irrelevant information about her enrollment and her previous residence in Phoenix. The 23 heartbeats creating symphony that Edward typically tuned out through long practice, but that now registered as obstacles between him and escape after killing Bella, whose blood he wanted more than he had ever wanted anything across his entire existence, whether human or vampire. The murder scenarios formed automatically in his mind with clarity that horrified him, even as he calculated their feasibility and calculated their success rates based on his speed and his strength compared to human fragility and human slowness that made them easy prey for predator, whose capabilities exceeded theirs in every measurable dimension. He could reach across lab table and break her neck before she could scream. The sound of cervical vertebrae snapping would be audible only to his siblings whose enhanced hearing would detect the noise, but whose distance across classroom might delay their intervention long enough for him to begin feeding. The initial taste of her blood would make stopping nearly impossible, but the presence of witnesses would require him to complete feeding quickly, and would require him to kill everyone who saw what he was and what he was doing to their classmate, whose death would traumatize them seconds before their own deaths eliminated their ability to report his nature to authorities. The alternative scenario involved more time and more privacy. His tracking of Bella after school, and his attack in location without witnesses. Perhaps her bedroom during night when Charlie Swan slept unaware that monster was draining his daughter's blood, mere feet away from where father dozed peacefully in ignorance that would be shattered by morning discovery of exsanguinated corpse, whose death would be mystery that human investigators could never solve, because evidence would point nowhere, and because Edward's nature was beyond their comprehension and beyond their ability to imagine. The forest scenario offered advantages of isolation and offered advantages of disposal, when body left in Olympic wilderness might never be found, or might be found only after wildlife had obscured cause of death and had eliminated evidence that might otherwise point toward unusual circumstances surrounding teenage girl's disappearance from small town, where everyone knew everyone, and where stranger danger was abstract concept rather than being daily reality. His grip on edge of lab table tightened unconsciously as he cycled through these scenarios, his fingers creating dents in black composite material that would be visible evidence of supernatural strength. If anyone looked closely at damage he was inflicting through tension that he could not release, and through pressure that ordinary human grip could never achieve. The wood beneath composite surface compressed and splintered, the destruction occurring silently and occurring invisibly to human observers whose attention was focused on teacher's lecture about mitosis and meiosis that Edward could recite perfectly, despite his conscious mind being entirely consumed by battle between desire to kill girl sitting beside him and desire to maintain control that defined his identity and that separated him from monsters who killed without remorse and who killed without recognizing that human lives had value beyond providing sustenance for vampire appetites. Alice's gasp from across classroom registered in his awareness as sharp intake of breath that signaled vision. Her precognitive gift showing futures that branched based on his choices and based on whether he maintained control or whether he surrendered to bloodlust that was demanding satisfaction with intensity, that made every second feel like hour and made every breath he took purely for appearance sake feel like torture when Bella's scent intensified with each inhalation. Her vision showed massacre, showed Edward attacking Bella and then attacking witnesses and then fleeing Forks with family forced to abandon home that Esme had built and forced to abandon life they had established in community where they had been happy and had been safe, until Edward's lack of control destroyed everything and transformed him into killer whose body count would exceed 20 humans, whose only crime was being present, when his discipline finally shattered under weight of temptation that exceeded his capacity to resist. But Alice's vision also showed alternative future where Edward maintained control and where he survived biology class without killing anyone. The possibility existing alongside probability of massacre in quantum superposition. that would collapse into single reality based on choices he made across the next 53 minutes of proximity to Bella, whose heartbeat he could hear and whose pulse he could see in her throat, where carotid artery carried blood, whose scent promised ecstasy and promised relief from century of burning, thirst that animal blood could moderate but could never satisfy completely. The existence of future where he succeeded in restraint gave him anchor point, gave him goal that was achievable if he could maintain focus and could maintain commitment to values that Carlyle had taught him and that defined his identity as something beyond predator, whose existence was justified only through power and through taking what vampire nature suggested was his right. The hour stretched into eternity, each second requiring active choice to remain seated and active choice to not reach across 18 inches of space that separated him from Bella, whose proximity was torture and whose ignorance of danger she was in, created bitter irony when she should be fleeing and should be screaming, but instead was sitting calmly taking notes on mitosis, as though biology class was normal experience rather than being moment, where her life hung in balance determined entirely by vampire's wavering self-control. Excited, breathing stopped completely to minimize intake of her scent, his lungs freezing in position that humans would find uncomfortable, but that vampires could maintain indefinitely when breathing was habit rather than necessity, and when appearance of life mattered less than reducing sensory input that was overwhelming his capacity to process rationally. Mr. Banner's voice continued explaining cell division, the teacher's thoughts being focused on curriculum and being focused on ensuring students understood material that would appear on upcoming exam. His complete obliviousness to drama occurring at lab table near windows, creating frustration in Edward, whose telepathy meant he knew that no one suspected danger and no one recognized that student sitting rigidly in his seat was predator barely restrained from attacking prey, whose vulnerability was absolute and whose survival depended entirely on Edward's choice to value her life over his desire for her blood. The other students' thoughts cycled through typical teenage concerns about assignments and relationships and social dynamics that seemed absurd compared to life and death struggle occurring mere feet away from their positions, their shallow mental voices creating background noise that Edward usually found tedious, but that now provided small distraction from overwhelming focus on Bella's scent and Bella's heartbeat and Bella's complete edibility. The bell's ring signaling end of class period brought relief so profound that Edward felt physical weakness, his century of existence having never included moment that tested his control so completely, and having never included temptation that came so close to destroying his carefully constructed identity as vampire who chose not to kill humans, despite nature that was optimized specifically for human predation. His exit from classroom was controlled despite internal screaming, demanding he either feed or flee. His walk to parking lot appearing normal to human observers, whose perception could not detect tension in his movements, or could not detect fact that every step away from Bella Swan was victory over instinct that had nearly overwhelmed century of discipline during single biology class that had lasted 55 minutes, but that had felt like eternity. His siblings' concerned thoughts followed him to Volvo, their awareness of his struggle being complete through Alice's visions and through their observation of his behavior during class period that had tested him beyond anything they had witnessed despite decades of living together, and despite numerous situations where human blood had been present and had been tempting, but had never created crisis of this magnitude. Emmett's thought was simple worry about brother, whose control had never wavered before today. Rosalie's thought was irritation mixed with concern that Edward's potential loss of control could expose family and could destroy life they had built. Jasper's thought was empathic awareness of Edward's emotional state combined with his own struggle against bloodlust, that Edward's tension had intensified through emotional contagion, that Jasper's gift created when strong emotions around him affected his own state regardless of their source. Edward's decision formed during drive away from school, his recognition that he could not survive repeated exposure to Bella Swan's scent, and his recognition that proximity would eventually destroy his control, creating certainty that he needed to leave Forks immediately and needed to remove himself from temptation before inevitable failure occurred and before murder transformed him into monster he had spent centuries avoiding becoming. His turn toward Alaska instead of toward home represented flight response, his instinct for self-preservation finally overriding paralysis that had kept him frozen in seat during biology class. His plan being to reach Denali Coven and to remain there until Cullens could relocate away from Forks and away from girl whose blood sang to him in ways he could not resist indefinitely, regardless of how strong his commitment to vegetarian lifestyle had been. Before her scent had revealed that his control had limits, and that those limits could be exceeded by single human, whose chemistry happened to appeal to him beyond reason and beyond any rational explanation. But his turn back toward Forks, halfway to Alaska, represented arrogance mixed with self-destruction, his pride insisting that century of discipline should not be destroyed by a single human girl, and his determination to prove that his control was absolute, creating decision that was foolish and was dangerous, but that felt necessary to preserve his identity as vampire who chose humanity over monstrosity, despite nature that suggested opposite choice was his right and was his purpose. His return to school the following day would test whether pride was justified, or whether pride was simply prelude to fall that would destroy everything he valued, and would transform him into killer whose first victim would be girl, whose only crime was smelling more appealing than any human he had encountered across 92 years of vampire existence. Edward's return to Forks High School on Tuesday, January 25th, after week-long absence that he had spent in Denali, attempting to convince himself that single human girl should not have power to drive him away from family and away from life they had built, represented arrogance that he recognized even as he committed to decision whose wisdom was questionable at best and suicidal at worst, when returning meant subjecting himself to temptation that had nearly destroyed his control during single biology class. His rationalization during drive back from Alaska had been that century of discipline should count for something, and that fleeing from one human whose sense happened to appeal to him suggested weakness that he refused to acknowledge in himself, his pride insisting that he was stronger than his bloodlust, and that he could prove his control by returning to situation that had tested him so completely during their first encounter. The biology classroom on his first day back represented torture chamber, whose design was specifically calculated to maximize his suffering. The seating arrangement that placed Bella Swan 18 inches from his position, creating proximity that was intimate and was inescapable, when Mr. Banner's class structure required partners to sit together and required them to share lab equipment and required them to collaborate on assignments that demanded conversation and demanded interaction that normal humans would find unremarkable, but that Edward experienced as extended exercise in restraint that required every second of his concentration to maintain. Her scent had not diminished during his week away, the fan still blowing air currents that carried her fragrance directly to his position, still creating physical response that his body executed automatically, despite his mind's determination to remain in control. His venom still pooling and his muscles still tensing with predatory readiness that he had to consciously suppress through constant vigilance. The murder scenarios that had formed during their first encounter returned with increased detail and increased specificity. His week away, having provided time for his mind to refine plans and to calculate probabilities and to assess risks that each approach would entail, when killing Bella would require either accepting witnesses whose deaths would multiply his crime, or accepting delay that would allow him to kill her privately without creating exposure that would endanger his family. The parking lot scenario played out in his imagination during first period, his visualization of waiting until cars cleared and until Bella walked alone to her truck, creating opportunity where he could approach her in darkness and could kill her quickly before anyone witnessed attack and before anyone could intervene to save her from predator whose speed and whose strength made human resistance meaningless and made human survival dependent entirely on his choice to refrain from killing, rather than on any defensive capability they might possess. The bedroom scenario elaborated across second period, his knowledge of Charlie Swan's work schedule at police station and his knowledge of Bella's after-school routine, creating window of opportunity where he could enter her home during evening hours and could kill her in her bedroom, where privacy was guaranteed and where disposal of body would be simpler than parking lot scenario that risked discovery before he could remove evidence. His ability to move silently and his ability to scale walls without equipment made entry trivial. The window he had noticed during his drive past her house being accessible and being unlocked based on his observation of its position and based on typical human carelessness about security in small town, where crime was rare and where residents assumed safety that was illusory, when predator like Edward existed in their community without their knowledge. The forest scenario refined itself during third period. His familiarity with Olympic wilderness and his knowledge of areas where hikers never ventured, creating ideal location for attack that would leave no evidence and would leave no body for investigators to find when wildlife would scatter remains and would eliminate traces that might otherwise point toward foul play. His plan involved following Bella during weekend and involved engineering encounter that would seem coincidental, his presence in forest appearing innocent until moment when isolation was complete and when her screams would carry nowhere and when her death would be private communion between predator and prey, whose blood he would finally taste after days of restraint that felt like self-inflicted torture without purpose and without reward beyond maintenance of identity that seemed increasingly fragile and increasingly arbitrary. The discipline required to sit beside her during fourth period biology class exceeded anything Edward had experienced across his vampire existence. His proximity to her creating constant temptation that his internal monologue could not adequately moderate when scent and sound and sight of her overwhelmed rational thought, an overwhelmed commitment to vegetarian philosophy that seemed like pointless affectation, when her blood promised satisfaction that animal blood could never provide, regardless of how many deer or mountain lions he drained in attempt to build buffer against her appeal. His breathing remained stopped throughout class period, his lungs frozen to minimize intake of scent that even in trace amounts created burning in his throat that demanded satisfaction and demanded feeding, that his conscious mind refused, but that his body craved with intensity that made every second feel like battle between desire and discipline. His hands gripped edge of lab table throughout class with pressure that created progressively deeper dents in composite material. The damage accumulating across week as each day's class period required same restraint and required same physical outlet for tension that could not be released through action and could not be released through feeding that his instincts demanded. The wood beneath surface splintered incrementally, the destruction occurring in layers that would eventually compromise structural integrity of table, but that currently remained invisible to human observers, whose attention never focused on furniture and whose perception could not detect subtle changes that vampire strength was inflicting through unconscious grip. There was only outlet for frustration that Edward could permit himself when more satisfying outlets would involve Bella's death. His telepathic monitoring of other students' thoughts about Bella created additional torture. Their innocent observations about new girl and their shallow romantic interest in her, forming contrast to his own thoughts that were anything but innocent and anything but romantic, when his primary mental activity involved calculating how to kill her most efficiently and how to feed from her most completely, before necessity of stopping would force him to abandon her corpse with blood still remaining that he would never taste. Mike Newton's thoughts were particularly irritating because his obvious attraction to Bella and his planning of strategy to ask her to some school dance created territorial response in Edward that was irrational and was dangerous, when feeling possessive about prey was short step toward attacking anyone who threatened his eventual feeding, and toward defending his claim to victim who was not his and who would never be his, except possibly as corpse whose blood he drained during moment of failure. Tyler Crowley's thoughts about Bella registered similarly, his interest in her and his apology tour following Van incident that Edward had not yet witnessed in this timeline, but that he knew was coming based on Alice's visions creating irritation that Edward recognized as inappropriate, when humans had every right to pursue romantic interest in classmate, and when Edward's own interest in Bella was predatory rather than romantic, despite his mind's attempts to frame obsession as something other than hunting focus that experienced trackers developed toward particularly appealing prey. Eric Yorke's thoughts were less developed but equally annoying. His aesthetic appreciation of Bella's appearance and his mental catalogue of her features creating desire in Edward to inform him that Bella was not available and that interest in her was dangerous when proximity to her attracted attention from predator who had not yet decided whether to kill her, but who was monitoring all potential obstacles to eventual feeding. The contrast between their innocent thoughts and his violent thoughts created self-loathing that characterized Edward's internal state throughout first week of resumed classes. His awareness that normal human teenagers were having normal human reactions to pretty new girl, while vampires sitting among them was planning her murder in elaborate detail, creating recognition that he was monster regardless of century of vegetarian practice and regardless of Carlyle's philosophy that suggested vampires could choose humanity over monstrosity, when evidence suggested that nature ultimately determined behavior and that Edward's nature was killer, whose current restraint was temporary condition that would eventually fail under sustained temptation. His recognition that he was more dangerous to Bella than any human threat she faced created bitter irony when Mike and Tyler and Eric might hurt her feelings through adolescent social incompetence, but Edward would hurt her through draining every drop of blood from her body during feeding that would kill her as surely as any attack, and that would end her life before her 18th birthday, that she would never reach if his control failed during one of their daily biology classes. His nightly hunting trips intensified during that first week. His attempts to build buffer against Bella's appeal through gorging himself on animal blood, creating routine, where he killed more prey than necessary and drained more blood than he needed, in desperate attempt to reduce burning in his throat that might make sitting beside Bella marginally more bearable during following day's biology class. The strategy failed completely. The animal blood providing physical sustenance, but providing no relief from specific craving for Bella's blood that was distinct from general thirst, and that was targeted rather than being satisfied by substitute when her chemistry and her scent created desire that was personal rather than being generic vampire hunger that any blood could satisfy. Mountain lion blood that normally would be highlight of hunt and normally would provide satisfaction, tasted like ash compared to remembered scent of Bella's blood that he had never tasted, but that his imagination supplied with detail that was probably inaccurate, but that felt absolutely real during moments when his control wavered and when feeding seemed inevitable rather than seeming like possibility he was successfully avoiding. His awareness that he was losing battle incrementally created despair that characterized his emotional state throughout week. His recognition that each day's successful restraint required more effort than previous day, and that trajectory suggested eventual failure when discipline that felt absolute on Monday felt tenuous by Friday, and when progression indicated that following week would test him beyond his capacity to maintain control. The mathematics of probability suggested that his resistance had limits, and that sustained exposure to temptation that exceeded anything he had experienced would eventually overcome discipline that was strong but was not infinite. His century of vegetarian practice providing foundation but not providing guarantee when unprecedented situation created unprecedented strain on capabilities that had never been tested so completely or so continuously across extended period. His rationalization that knowing Bella's thoughts would help him resist her created justification for obsessive focus on her silent mind. His frustration and her immunity to his telepathy transforming from annoyance into desperate need to understand why she was different and why her mind was closed to him when every other human consciousness was open book whose contents he could read without effort, and without their awareness that privacy they assumed was illusory when telepath sat nearby. His theory that understanding her thoughts would demystify her and would reduce her appeal was probably false rationalization. His actual motivation being curiosity that transcended bloodlust and that represented different form of obsession that was equally dangerous when intellectual fascination combined with predatory desire created dual motivation for focusing on her that made leaving impossible even when leaving was obviously correct choice for her safety and for his maintenance of identity. The war between intellectual curiosity and predatory desire characterized his internal state during biology classes, his attention splitting between planning her murder and planning conversation that might reveal why her mind was silent and might reveal what made her different from every other human he had encountered across centuries of reading thoughts without consent and without effort. His questions during lab work were calculated to extract information while appearing casual. His inquiries about her move from Phoenix and her adjustment to Forks being cover for assessment of her personality, an assessment of whether her mental silence reflected unusual psychology or reflected supernatural immunity that had no precedent in his experience and had no explanation in his understanding of how telepathic gifts functioned. Her responses to his questions revealed intelligence and revealed self-awareness that made her more interesting and made her more dangerous to his equilibrium. Her observations about Forks being astute and her comments about her mother being affectionate, creating picture of person rather than picture of prey, when details of her life and details of her relationships made her three-dimensional in ways that victims should not be three-dimensional if killing them was going to remain emotionally feasible. His recognition that learning about her was making murder harder rather than easier created frustration when strategy was backfiring and when knowing her was creating empathy that complicated bloodlust rather than simplifying it through familiarity that should breed contempt or should breed indifference, but that instead was breeding fascination. His family's concern about his state was evident through their thoughts during evening hours when they gathered at home, and when his tension was palpable, despite his attempts to appear controlled and to appear normal, when nothing about situation was normal, and nothing about his behavior suggested he was managing temptation successfully. Jasper's empathic awareness of Edward's emotional volatility created worry about brother, whose feelings were cycling between desire and self-hatred, with intensity that Jasper had never sensed from Edward despite decades of cohabitation. His gift making him sensitive to emotional states that others might miss, and making him aware that Edward's control was more tenuous than Edward was admitting, and more fragile than Edward's outward behavior suggested. Emmett's thoughts were concerned, but were less analytical. His simple worry about brother, who seemed stressed, combining with his offers to hunt together or to engage in activities that might distract Edward from whatever was bothering him, when Emmett's straightforward nature made him uncomfortable with psychological complexity and made him prefer physical solutions to emotional problems. Rosalie's thoughts mixed irritation with concern. Her assessment that Edward was being foolish by remaining near human, who clearly tested his control beyond wise limits, creating resentment that his choices might endanger family, combined with genuine worry that her brother might fail and might transform himself into killer whose murder would devastate him, regardless of whether exposure occurred. Alice's visions showed branching futures where Edward's control held and where Edward's control failed. Her precognitive monitoring of possibilities being constant throughout week, as she watched for signs that one future was becoming more probable than another, and as she prepared to intervene if massacre became inevitable rather than remaining theoretical possibility that Edward was successfully avoiding through discipline that Alice could see was eroding despite his determination. Carlyle's quiet disappointment was worst of all family responses, his thoughts being characterized by sadness rather than by anger when his hope that Edward would choose to leave Fawkes and would choose to remove himself from temptation had been disappointed by Edward's return and by Edward's insistence that he could handle a situation that was clearly beyond what any vampire should attempt to handle, when sustained exposure to maximally tempting prey was recipe for disaster, regardless of how strong previous control had been. His private conversation with Edward during week involved gentle suggestion that leaving was still option and that choosing safety over pride was wisdom rather than weakness, his paternal concern being evident despite his respect for Edward's autonomy and despite his recognition that Edward was an adult vampire whose decisions were his own to make even when those decisions seemed unwise to father, who had centuries of experience suggesting that some temptations should be avoided rather than being confronted. Edward's response to Carlyle was defensive assertion that century of discipline should enable him to sit in biology class without murdering classmate. His pride preventing admission that situation was exceeding his control and his determination to prove himself preventing acceptance of help that Carlyle was offering through suggestion that removing himself from temptation was legitimate choice rather than being shameful retreat. The conversation ended without resolution. Edward's stubbornness meeting Carlyle's wisdom in stalemate, where neither position prevailed, and where Edward's choice to continue attending school was respected despite concerns and despite recognition that respect for autonomy sometimes meant allowing someone to make mistake whose consequences might be catastrophic. The morning of Tuesday, the 25th of January, brought snow to Fawkes that had been predicted by weather forecasters and by Alice's visions. The white precipitation creating driving hazards that Edward noted with passing concern during his drive to school with his siblings, whose supernatural reflexes made winter conditions irrelevant, but whose human facade required them to pretend caution that they did not actually need when ice and snow posed no threat to vampires whose coordination and whose reaction time exceeded human capability by orders of magnitude. The parking lot at Fawkes High School was slick with compacted snow and ice that students navigated carefully, their human fragility making them vulnerable to falls and vulnerable to vehicular accidents that could result from reduced traction and from reduced visibility that snowfall created through atmospheric conditions that affected human senses far more than vampire senses, whose clarity remained perfect regardless of weather. Alice's gasp during their walk toward school building registered in Edward's awareness as alarm, her sudden vision showing future that was seconds away and showing disaster that required immediate intervention if tragedy was to be prevented, and if human life was to be saved from accident whose cause was mechanical failure, combined with driver error, combined with unfortunate positioning that placed Bella Swan directly in path of Tyler Crowley's van that was sliding out of control across icy parking lot toward location where Bella stood beside her truck, completely unaware of danger approaching from behind her position. The vision showed impact, showed Bella's body crushed between Tyler's van and her own truck, showed her death occurring instantly from massive trauma that human body could not survive when ton of metal moving at speed, sufficient to cross parking lot, compressed fragile human form between two solid surfaces. Edward's calculation occurred in microsecond, his mind assessing options and assessing consequences with supernatural speed that allowed him to evaluate scenario completely before human observer could blink or could register that anything unusual was occurring. Option 1 was allowing accident to proceed without intervention. Bella's death, solving his problem permanently, and removing temptation that had tortured him for weeks, and removing source of bloodlust that threatened his control daily during biology classes, where her proximity tested him beyond anything he had experienced across centuries of vampire existence. Her death would be tragic, but would be explicable through natural causes. The accident being witnessed by multiple students whose testimony would confirm mechanical failure and would confirm that no supernatural intervention had occurred, and would confirm that death was unfortunate incident rather than being murder or being event requiring investigation beyond normal accident assessment. Option 2 was saving her through revealing his supernatural nature to witnesses who would see his impossible speed across parking lot and would see his impossible strength stopping van that weighed thousands of pounds and that carried momentum that human body could never arrest regardless of positioning or regardless of leverage. Saving Bella meant exposing his family to scrutiny and meant exposing them to danger from Volturi, whose enforcement of secrecy laws was absolute, and whose response to exposure was typically destruction of vampires who had revealed themselves and destruction of humans who had witnessed revelation that threatened to expose vampire civilization to broader human awareness that would create existential threat to species whose survival depended on remaining hidden and remaining dismissed as mythology rather than being recognized as predatory reality. His body moved before his mind completed analysis, his decision being made by instinct rather than being made by logic, when conscious thought suggested allowing Bella's death, while unconscious imperative demanded her preservation regardless of cost and regardless of exposure risk that saving her would create. His speed across parking lot was blatant supernatural display. His movement from his position near school building to Bella's position near her truck occurring faster than human eye could track, and occurring obviously impossibly when distance and time required velocity that no human could achieve, and that no natural explanation could rationalize. His hand caught Tyler's van with impact that should have broken bones, but that instead arrested vehicle's momentum completely, the ton of metal stopping instantly against his palm, while Bella stood inches away from impact point, where her body would have been crushed if Edward's intervention had been delayed by a single additional second. The silence following impact was profound. The parking lot's ambient noise of student conversation and vehicle engines seeming to stop as witnesses processed what they had seen or thought they had seen, when Edward's speed made observation uncertain and made memory questionable, because human perception was not designed to track vampire movement, and human cognition was not designed to accept supernatural explanation for events that seemed impossible. Bella's consciousness registered in Edward's peripheral awareness, her brown eyes wide with shock and with confusion, as she looked at Edward, whose position beside her truck could not be explained through normal means when she had seen him standing across parking lot mere seconds before, and when physical law suggested he could not have crossed distance in time available regardless of how fast he ran. His damage control began immediately with lies and with misdirection. His casual dismissal of her observations and his insistence that she was confused about his starting position, creating alternative narrative that was false, but that was more acceptable than truth, that would require her to believe in vampires, and would require her to recognize that classmate who sat beside her in biology was predator whose nature was designed for killing humans like her. His awareness of witnesses created urgency when multiple students had observed incident, and when multiple perspectives would create composite picture that might overcome individual uncertainty about what had been seen and might create consensus that something impossible had occurred that required explanation beyond normal accident assessment. The school nurse's arrival and the ambulance response created chaos that Edward used strategically. His insistence that he had been standing beside Bella when Van approached, and his insistence that Tyler's vehicle had not actually struck anyone, creating confusion about sequence of events and creating doubt about initial observations that witnesses had made during moments of crisis, when adrenaline and shock made perception unreliable and made memory subject to suggestion. His performance was convincing because he needed it to be convincing, his family's safety depending on his ability to gaslight witnesses and to gaslight Bella, whose persistent questioning suggested she was not accepting his explanations and was not forgetting what she had seen, despite his attempts to rewrite her memory through confident assertion that her observations were mistaken. The hospital evaluation brought additional complications. Carlisle's presence as attending physician creating situation where father examined son's supposed injuries while both maintained human facade and both participated in charade that Edward had been involved in accident that had required supernatural intervention to prevent fatalities. The privacy of examination room allowed brief, honest conversation. Carlisle's worry evident through his thoughts, even though his spoken words remained professionally appropriate and remained focused on medical assessment that was unnecessary, but that protocol required. His question about whether exposure had occurred was delivered quietly. His concern about Volturi attention and his concern about family safety being paramount, when Edward's choice to save Bella had prioritized her life over their secrecy and had created vulnerability that enemies could exploit if knowledge of incident reached Italy and reached ancient vampires whose authority over vampire civilization was absolute. Edward's recognition that he had destroyed his family's carefully built life in Forks for human girl he had been planning to murder created self-loathing that exceeded even his normal baseline of vampire self-hatred. His awareness that single impulsive decision had potentially endangered everyone he loved creating guilt that would characterize his emotional state for weeks following the incident and creating determination to minimize damage through whatever means necessary, including manipulation and including lies that were comprehensive and were delivered with conviction that made truth seem uncertain and made supernatural explanation seem paranoid rather than seeming accurate. His certainty that saving Bella had been involuntary rather than being conscious choice created terror at his own lack of control. His recognition that his body had moved without his permission and had prioritized her survival over rational assessment, suggesting that whatever hold she had over him transcended bloodlust and transcended intellectual curiosity, and represented something more dangerous and more irrational than either of those explicable obsessions. Rosalie's fury during family meeting that evening was entirely justified. Her accusations that Edward had prioritized one human over entire family safety, being accurate assessment of what had occurred, and being legitimate grievance when his choice had created exposure risk that affected everyone, and that potentially endangered existence that they had built across years of careful maintenance of human facade. Her argument that Bella's life was not worth risk to family was logical and was defensible. Her position being that individual human whose lifespan was measured in decades did not justify endangering immortal vampires whose existence spanned centuries and whose family bonds transcended temporary attachment to prey, whose appeal was biochemical accident rather than being meaningful connection worth sacrificing safety to preserve. His inability to explain even to himself why Bella's life had mattered more than secrecy created frustration when rational analysis suggested Rosalie was correct and suggested his choice had been indefensible selfishness motivated by obsession rather than being heroic rescue motivated by compassion. The awareness that he should leave Forks and should remove himself from Bella's proximity competed with awareness that he could not force himself to go when addiction was already too strong and when her continued existence in world felt necessary to his own continued existence in ways he could not articulate and could not justify through logic or through philosophy. Edward's obsessive monitoring of Bella, despite his claims to himself and to his family that he was giving her appropriate distance and was respecting boundaries that humans deserved, represented self-deception that he recognized even as he engaged in behavior that was definitionally stalking when his tracking of her movements and his listening for her thoughts that he could not actually hear created surveillance that was comprehensive and was intrusive and was entirely unjustifiable through any rationalization about protection or about concern for her safety. His awareness of her planned trip to Port Angeles with Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber during second week of March registered through his eavesdropping on their lunch conversation. His telepathic monitoring of Jessica's thoughts providing complete itinerary, including bookstore visit and dress shopping for spring dance and dinner at restaurant, whose location Jessica had researched and had shared with her friends during their planning session that Edward had no legitimate reason to monitor and no legitimate reason to care about when Bella's activities outside school were none of his business and were outside scope of any relationship they had established through awkward biology lab partnership. His decision to follow them to Port Angeles occurred without conscious deliberation. His evening hunt with Emmett being abandoned in favor of drive to coastal town, where Bella would be shopping and would be vulnerable to dangers that Edward's paranoid imagination supplied with detail that was probably excessive, but that felt urgent when his protective instincts toward her had become irrational and had become all-consuming, despite his attempts to maintain appropriate distance and despite his recognition that his behavior was crossing lines that should not be crossed. His justification that Port Angeles was a dangerous city where young women needed protection was weak rationalization, when statistics suggested Forks was equally dangerous, and when his actual motivation was addiction to her presence, an addiction to monitoring her safety that had become compulsive rather than being occasional concern that normal acquaintance might feel. The moment he heard thoughts of would-be attackers from miles away created rage that transcended anything Edward had experienced across his century of vampire existence. The mental voices of 4 men whose intentions toward Bella were explicit and were vile, triggering response that was protective fury, combined with murderous hatred that was pure and was focused and was entirely divorced from bloodlust, when his desire to kill them had nothing to do with feeding and had everything to do with eliminating threats to Bella, whose vulnerability to human predators was absolute and whose trust in basic human decency was about to be catastrophically violated by men who viewed women as objects and who viewed isolated young women as opportunity, rather than as person deserving of safety and deserving of respect. Their thoughts painted detailed picture of their plans, their casual discussion of what they would do to her, making Edward's hands tighten on steering wheel until leather compressed and until metal beneath began to bend under pressure that normal human grip could never achieve, regardless of emotional state or regardless of adrenaline response that humans experience during crisis. His drive toward Port Angeles accelerated beyond legal limits and beyond safe limits, when his speed exceeded what traffic conditions warranted, and when his focus narrowed to single purpose of reaching Bella before men whose thoughts were becoming more specific and more vile could act on intentions that their mental voices broadcast with clarity that made Edward's telepathy feel like curse rather than gift, when knowing human depravity in such detail created rage that demanded outlet and demanded satisfaction through violence that would eliminate threats permanently. Alice's frantic phone, calls warning him not to do what her visions showed him doing, registered peripherally in his awareness, her precognitive gift showing futures where he slaughtered 4 men in street, and showing futures where exposure occurred, and showing futures where Volturi attention focused on Cullen's, whose member had committed public massacre, motivated by protection of human girl, whose importance to him would be obvious and would be inexplicable to ancient vampires whose philosophy about human life was entirely different from vegetarian perspective that Cullen's maintained. The sight of Bella cornered in alley with men whose bodies blocked her escape route and whose intentions were absolutely clear through their thoughts and through their positioning created decision point, where Edward's rage demanded immediate violence and where his century of discipline demanded restraint that felt impossible, when protective fury was overwhelming rational assessment and was demanding that he kill threats before they could harm her. His grip on steering wheel during approach created spiderweb cracks in metal frame, the damage being visible evidence of supernatural strength and being visible evidence of rage that was barely contained, when every instinct screamed that he should exit vehicle and should slaughter men. Thoughts revealed them as predators who had done this before and who would do this again if they survived encounter with vampire, whose protective instincts made him more dangerous than any human threat they had ever faced. The restraint required to simply insert himself between Bella and attackers, rather than ripping them apart where they stood, exceeded any discipline Edward had exercised across his vampire existence, his entire body vibrating with barely suppressed violence as he opened passenger door and commanded Bella to get in car with tone that was harsh and was inflexible because speaking gently was beyond his capacity when rage was consuming his awareness and was demanding satisfaction through killing that would be easy, and would be satisfying, and would eliminate threats that deserved elimination regardless of human laws, and regardless of vampire laws that suggested low profile was preferable to public violence. The men's thoughts shifted from predatory confidence to confusion to fear as they registered his presence and registered something in his appearance or his posture that triggered survival instinct warning them that situation had changed and that intended victim was now protected by someone dangerous. His drive away from Ali was controlled only through supreme effort, his hands destroying steering wheel incrementally as he maintained grip that was slowly deforming metal and slowly cracking leather, while his mind cycled through detailed murder scenarios that his imagination supplied with thoroughness that horrified him, even as he indulged fantasies of violence that felt righteous and felt necessary when men who would rape young women deserved death and deserved suffering before death occurred. The first man would die from broken neck, the quick snap being merciful compared to what Edward wanted to do, but being efficient when time would be limited before witnesses arrived or before other victims fled. The second man would die more slowly, Edward's hands crushing windpipe and allowing suffocation that would take minutes rather than seconds, and would allow terror to register, and would allow regret to form before consciousness faded and before death claimed him. The third man would experience what Bella would have experienced, the violation and the helplessness and the terror of knowing that survival was uncertain and that mercy was not coming, and that Predator had decided his fate and would execute judgment without hesitation and without remorse, because actions had consequences and because predation of vulnerable humans by stronger humans triggered protective response in vampire, whose own predatory nature recognized kindred behavior and rejected it as intolerable. The fourth man would beg, his thoughts already showing that his courage was performative and was dependent on pack mentality that evaporated when pack was being systematically destroyed by opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything they had imagined and whose rage exceeded anything they had triggered in previous victims who had been appropriately terrified, but who had not been protected by someone capable of and willing to exact revenge. His honest confession to Bella that he wanted to kill them and that he still wanted to kill them represented a moment of transparency that was unusual for Edward, whose typical approach was obscuring his nature and obscuring his thoughts behind careful facade that suggested he was civilized and suggested he was safe when reality was that he was Predator, whose restraint was choice rather than being nature. Her acceptance of his confession and her lack of horror at his admission created confusion when normal human response to vampire confessing desire to commit murder should be fear and should be distance rather than being apparent, understanding and apparent lack of judgment that suggested Bella's self-preservation instincts were fundamentally broken or fundamentally absent when her response to danger was moving closer rather than moving away. The temptation to circle back after dropping Bella at a restaurant where Jessica waited was overwhelming. His desire to complete violence that protective fury demanded competing with awareness that returning to scene would constitute murder rather than constituting defense when threat had passed, and when killing would be revenge rather than being protection. His drive through Port Angeles streets was slow patrol as he tracked men's locations through their thoughts, his monitoring of their positions and their intentions, creating detailed map of where they were and where they would be, and how he could reach them without witnesses and without exposure if he chose to abandon restraint and chose to satisfy rage that felt entirely justified when men who would harm Bella deserved elimination regardless of human laws that protected perpetrators more than victims. Alice's continued calls warning him away from choice that her visions showed as probable created lifeline that Edward used to maintain discipline. Her precognitive monitoring showing futures where he killed them and futures where he maintained control, and futures where exposure occurred based on choices he made during next hours, when temptation was strongest and when justification felt absolute. His eventual decision to hunt mountain lions instead of hunting humans represented compromise where violence found outlet that was acceptable and where killing satisfied need for physical action, even though prey was animal rather than being men who deserved death more than innocent wildlife, whose only crime was being available and being acceptable target for vampire whose vegetarian philosophy allowed animal death while prohibiting human death regardless of circumstances. The recognition during Hunt that he was capable of murder and was willing to commit murder under certain circumstances created moral crisis that characterized Edward's internal state for days following Port Angeles incident. His awareness that vegetarianism was choice rather than being nature, meaning that his identity as vampire who did not kill humans was contingent and was conditional rather than being absolute principle that could never be violated when protection of Bella apparently superseded every other value and apparently justified violence that he would never consider under normal circumstances. His visualization during mountain lion kill was detailed substitution, where animals' death represented proxy for human deaths he wanted to cause. His hands that broke animals' neck, imagining different neck and different victim whose death would be justice, rather than being murder when men who had raped deserved killing more than animals who were innocent. Carlyle's wisdom during Edward's confession about temptation represented understanding rather than judgment. His father's recognition that protection of innocent could justify violence that would otherwise be prohibited, creating permission that Edward had not expected, and creating validation that made him feel less monstrous, even though desire to kill humans violated everything Carlyle had taught him about value of human life and about importance of maintaining vegetarian philosophy, regardless of circumstances. The conversation about whether he was still good if he wanted to brutally murder humans who threatened Bella created philosophical exploration of morality and created examination of whether ends justified means and whether protection justified killing. When typical vampire philosophy suggested that killing was acceptable and that human laws were irrelevant to supernatural beings whose power made them exempt from mortal consequences. His recognition that love or obsession or whatever feeling Bella inspired in him made him more dangerous rather than less dangerous represented terrifying insight about his nature. His awareness that caring about someone removed restraints rather than adding restraints when threat to beloved triggered protective fury that exceeded bloodlust in intensity and exceeded rational response in scope. The vegetarian vampire who chose not to kill humans became potential murderer when humans threatened girl, whose safety mattered more than principles, and whose life mattered more than his carefully constructed identity as civilized being, who chose compassion over violence despite nature that was optimized for killing and despite instincts that demanded predation, regardless of philosophical objections to vampire nature's apparent design specifications. Edward's decision to show Bella what he truly was in full sunlight represented death wish disguised as honesty, his recognition that revealing his vampire nature completely and revealing his diamond-like skin and revealing his supernatural capabilities would either confirm her acceptance or would trigger appropriate human fear that would end relationship, whose continuation was dangerous for her and was torture for him when constant proximity without physical intimacy created frustration and created yearning that could not be satisfied without risking her life through loss of control during moment of passion. His selection of meadow far from hiking trails and far from potential witnesses created private space where revelation could occur without exposure risk and where her reaction would be unobserved by humans whose presence would complicate situation. If Bella's response was screaming or fleeing or calling authorities to report monster whose existence violated every natural law and violated human understanding of what was possible. The hike to meadow through forest that Edward knew intimately from decades of hunting created extended anticipation, where his hyper-awareness of Bella's fragility and Bella's mortality intensified with every step she took and with every stumble she made over roots and rocks, that his supernatural grace allowed him to navigate effortlessly, while her human clumsiness made progress slow and made journey feel dangerous when single fall could injure her and could create bleeding that would test his control in isolated location where witnesses were absent and where help was distant. Her heartbeat and her warmth and her scent surrounded him during hike, the sensory input creating constant temptation that background of his awareness processed. Even while his conscious mind focused on impending revelation and focused on possibility that showing her his true nature would be final interaction they shared, when her fear would be legitimate response and would be healthy response, that her previous lack of appropriate self-preservation had prevented. His fear that revealing his sparkling skin would break whatever spell made her tolerate his presence exceeded his fear of bloodlust and exceeded his fear of exposure. His awareness that human reaction to vampire appearance in sunlight was typically revulsion or was typically terror-creating certainty that Bella would finally see him as monster rather than seeing him as attractive, mysterious boy whose danger she romanticized rather than recognizing as existential threat to her continued survival. The moment of stepping into sunlight that flooded meadow required courage that facing physical danger never required, his vulnerability being emotional rather than physical when Bella's rejection would hurt him more than any wound and would confirm his self-assessment as monster unworthy of love and unworthy of connection with human, whose humanity represented everything he had lost and could never reclaim. The sun's rays hitting his skin created a prismatic display as light refracted through crystalline structure that vampire transformation had created, his entire body glittering like diamond and sparkling with intensity that was beautiful and was alien and was obviously supernatural when no human skin could achieve such effect and when no natural explanation could account for phenomenon that violated physics and violated biology. His self-loathing monologue delivered while Bella stared represented most honest assessment of his nature he had ever spoken aloud. His description of himself as killer and his insistence that his beautiful skin was skin of predator, designed to lure prey creating framework, where beauty was weapon and was trap, rather than being gift or being aesthetic quality worthy of admiration. Her facial expression during revelation registered in Edward's desperate observation as fascination rather than revulsion. Her lack of appropriate fear, creating frustrated confusion when her response should be screaming and should be running, but instead was reaching toward him as though she wanted to touch skin that should repel her and should trigger survival instinct that her broken self-preservation apparently lacked. His demonstration of strength through crushing granite boulder into powder and through ripping mature tree trunk from ground with single pull represented escalation of revelation. His need to prove his danger and his need to make her understand that he was not human and was not safe, becoming desperate. When her continued lack of fear suggested she was not processing information correctly, or was not understanding that beauty concealed lethality that could end her life in seconds. His demonstration of speed involved disappearing from her sight and reappearing behind her and beside her and above her in rapid succession. That disoriented her, and that should have terrified her when his movement was obviously impossible and was obviously supernatural and was obviously threat. When predator who could move faster than human eye could track was predator who could never be escaped through running and could never be fought through human strength that was meaningless compared to supernatural capabilities he was displaying. The trees he circled during demonstration created blur in human vision, his speed making him invisible during movement and making him appear to teleport rather than appearing to run when velocity exceeded what human perception was designed to process and exceeded what human cognition was designed to accept as possible. His confession about wanting to kill her and about planning her murder during biology class represented ultimate honesty that should have ended any possibility of relationship. His admission that he had sat beside her, calculating which method of killing would be most efficient and which disposal method would be most effective, creating detailed picture of danger she had been in and danger she remained in when his control was choice rather than being guarantee, and when bloodlust remained constant, temptation despite weeks of exposure that should have created habituation, but that had created only deeper obsession. The truth about their first meeting emerged without filter. His description of how her scent had affected him and how close he had come to massacring entire biology class to feed on her representing confession that was designed to drive her away through revealing exactly how dangerous he was and how unstable his control had been during their early encounters. Her continued lack of appropriate fear after confession created something approaching anger in Edward, whose frustration at her refusal to protect herself from him was becoming overwhelming. His recognition that she should be afraid and should be maintaining distance for her own safety, competing with selfish desire that she stay close and that she continue relationship that was inappropriate and was dangerous, but was only source of meaning. His century of existence had provided beyond family bonds and beyond vegetarian philosophy that felt empty compared to connection he felt with human, whose mortality made every moment precious and made every interaction feel significant. The lion and lamb metaphor that emerged during their conversation represented perfect summary of their dynamic. His assessment that she was stupid lamb for trusting predator competing with his recognition that he was sick, masochistic lion for wanting prey to love him rather than wanting prey to fear him appropriately. His description of bloodlust and his explanation of what her scent did to him represented clinical detail about vampire nature that most humans never learn before being killed. His honesty about constant burning temptation and about physical response that her presence triggered, creating picture of relationship where his every moment near her was battle against instinct and was exercise in restraint that required concentration that should not be required in romantic relationship between equals. The confession made clear that they were not equals and could never be equals when power imbalance was absolute and when his strength and his speed made her survival dependent entirely on his choice, rather than being dependent on mutual respect or mutual restraint that characterized healthy human relationships between partners who neither one could kill the other accidentally during moment of passion or during moment of lost control. The moment she touched his face, despite his warnings and despite his revelations, represented either supreme trust or supreme foolishness. His frozen stillness in response to her contact, reflecting terror. That instinct would override conscious control, and that touch would trigger feeding response that he could not stop once initiated, when physical contact with her warm skin might create cascade of automatic responses that his conscious mind could not moderate or could not prevent once vampire nature took control and once predatory instinct overwhelmed. Disciplined restraint. Her fingers on his cheek felt like electricity and felt like fire. The warmth of her human skin against his cold vampire skin, creating sensation that was pleasurable and was terrifying. When pleasure was dangerous, and when anything that reduced his focus on control was threat to her continued survival. His admission that he had been visiting her room at night and watching her sleep represented final confession about extent of his stalking and extent of his obsession. His nightly vigils at her bedside being behavior that was criminal and was creepy and was entirely unjustifiable, except through recognition that he was vampire, whose nature included obsessive focus on prey, and whose protection of her required monitoring her safety during hours when she was most vulnerable and when human threats might materialize without her awareness. Her acceptance of stalker confession without appropriate horror and invasion of privacy, and without appropriate fear of predator who watched her unconscious, vulnerable form created bewilderment in Edward, whose understanding of human psychology suggested she should be angry and should be frightened, rather than being apparently touched by a tension that was fundamentally inappropriate. His recognition during Meadow revelation that he had confessed every reason she should run, and had demonstrated every capability that should trigger her flight instinct, but that she was moving closer instead of moving away, created existential confusion about human nature and about Bella's specific psychology that made her different from normal humans, whose self-preservation instincts functioned appropriately, and whose fear responses activated when confronted with danger. Her lack of fear was not courage, but was deficiency in survival instinct that made her vulnerable to predators both human and supernatural. Her tendency to trust when she should suspect, and her tendency to approach when she should flee, creating pattern of behavior that would get her killed eventually, whether by Edward or by other threat, that her broken self-preservation failed to recognize as dangerous until recognition came too late to save her life. The awareness that loving her meant constant vigilance against himself and constant assessment of his control and constant recognition that he was greatest threat to her safety created exhausting dynamic where a romantic relationship required him to simultaneously pursue connection and maintain distance in impossible balance that could not be sustained indefinitely when being with her tested his control, and when being without her was unbearable, since Port Angeles had proven that distance did not eliminate protective obsession and did not eliminate need to monitor her safety regardless of whether monitoring was appropriate or welcome. Edward's anxiety about bringing Bella to meet his family exceeded any nervousness he had experienced across his century of vampire existence. His recognition that he was introducing prey to predators, and that he was asking vegetarian vampires whose control was variable to tolerate presence of human, whose scent was appealing and whose vulnerability was absolute, creating situation where single moment of weakness from any family member would result in Bella's death and would result in tragedy that would destroy Edward, regardless of whether exposure occurred or whether killing remained private family catastrophe. His specific worry about Jasper, whose control was weakest among family members, and whose decades in southern vampire wars had involved creating newborn armies and had involved killing thousands of humans, made his empathic brother most dangerous variable in equation, where Bella's survival depended on everyone's restraint, and where weakest link would determine outcome, when single failure would be fatal, regardless of how strong other family members' control remained. Rosalie's hostility was evident through her thoughts before Bella even arrived at Cullen House. Her resentment that Edward was bringing human into their private space, and her assessment that Bella's presence endangered family through creating exposure risk and through creating vulnerability that enemies could exploit, making her opposition to meeting logical and making her coldness toward Bella justifiable when protecting family safety, was legitimate concern that Edward's obsession was overriding through prioritizing individual human over collective vampire security. Her position that Bella should remain ignorant of their nature and should remain distant from their family reflected reasonable assessment that knowledge created danger and that intimacy created attachment that would complicate inevitable separation when Bella's human life continued along mortal trajectory, while Edward's immortal existence continued indefinitely without aging and without natural death that would eventually claim her, regardless of how carefully he protected her from immediate threats. Emmett's curiosity about human who had captured Edward's attention was evident through his thoughts. His simple desire to meet girl who had made his brother act irrationally and had made his brother risk family safety, creating friendly interest that was uncomplicated by Rosalie's political concerns or by Jasper's control issues, but that still represented danger when Emmett's playful nature and Emmett's strength made him capable of accidentally killing Bella through gesture that he intended as friendly, but that human fragility could not withstand, when difference between vampire casual touch and vampire lethal force was measured in increments of restraint that required constant conscious moderation. His offers to arm wrestle Bella or to demonstrate strength were declined by Edward, whose monitoring of Emmett's thoughts revealed innocent intentions, but whose awareness of danger made him unwilling to allow physical contact between his strongest brother and his fragile human girlfriend, whose bones would shatter under pressure that Emmett considered gentle. Alice's visions had been monitoring futures where Bella survived visit versus futures where Bella died, since Edward had decided to bring her to house. her precognitive gift creating constant stream of branching possibilities that showed outcomes ranging from successful, peaceful meeting to catastrophic feeding that resulted from control failure by any family member whose restraint proved inadequate under sustained exposure to human, whose scent was concentrated in enclosed space where windows were closed and where air circulation made her presence pervasive rather than localized. Her cheerful confidence that meeting would succeed was based on probability assessment from her visions, rather than being based on certainty when futures remained fluid and remained dependent on choices that had not yet been made and on reactions that had not yet occurred. Her optimism providing comfort to Edward, whose anxiety was threatening to overwhelm his commitment to integration of Bella into family life. Esme's motherly warmth toward Bella was genuine and was immediate, her thoughts revealing delight at Edward's happiness and revealing hope that human girl might become permanent fixture in family through transformation or through continued relationship that would give Edward purpose and would give Edward joy. That century of solitary existence had denied him, despite family's love and despite family's companionship, that was meaningful but was not romantic partnership that Edward had been seeking without success across decades of searching. Her welcome made Bella comfortable in ways that Edward appreciated, her maternal instinct creating safe atmosphere that moderated tension and that made meeting feel less like assessment and more like genuine family introduction, where Bella's acceptance was foregone conclusion rather than being conditional outcome depending on her performance or depending on family's evaluation. Carlisle's perfect control and Carlisle's genuine interest in Bella as person rather than as prey made him only family member. Edward trusted completely with Bella's safety, his father's centuries of discipline, and his father's commitment to preserving human life, creating certainty that Carlisle would never harm her, regardless of temptation and regardless of circumstances that might test lesser vampires' restraint. His conversation with Bella about her life and about her interests demonstrated respect that treated her as individual worthy of attention, rather than treating her as Edward's accessory or as curiosity, whose only significance was her relationship to family member, his questions being substantive and his attention being focused in ways that made Bella feel valued beyond her connection to Edward. The constant monitoring of Jasper's emotional state through Edward's observation of his brother's thoughts and through Edward's assessment of his brother's physical positioning relative to Bella created exhausting vigilance where Edward's attention was divided between participating in conversation and tracking potential threat that Jasper represented, despite his genuine efforts to maintain control and despite his genuine desire to welcome Bella as family friend, rather than viewing her as prey whose blood would satisfy thirst that animal blood could moderate but could never eliminate. His positioning himself between Bella and Jasper at all times created physical barrier that would allow intervention if Jasper's control failed. His readiness to move at supernatural speed to protect Bella from his own brother, representing sad necessity when family member who should be safe was actually dangerous and was actually greater threat than strangers whose proximity Edward could limit and whose access Edward could prevent. The baseball game invitation represented Alice's attempt to share family activity with Bella and represented opportunity for Bella to witness vampire capabilities in context where supernatural speed and supernatural strength were fully displayed, rather than being moderated for human comfort. Her vision showing future where game occurred during thunderstorm, and showing future where Bella enjoyed spectacle, and showed future where family bonded with her through shared experience. Edward's hesitation about exposing Bella to family activity where control might slip during excitement and during competitive engagement was overridden by Alice's certainty and by his own desire to share aspects of vampire existence with Bella that were joyful, rather than being only dangerous or only tragic. When his revelations had focused on monster aspects and had not adequately conveyed that vampire life included pleasure and included activities beyond hunting and beyond mere survival. His awareness during game that Jasper was struggling more than usual created heightened alert state where Edward's enjoyment of baseball was entirely subordinated to protection duty. His monitoring of Jasper's emotional state and his assessment of wind direction and his calculation of distance between Jasper and Bella, creating constant risk assessment that required a portion of his attention and required readiness to intervene if brother's control wavered toward failure. The concentration of Bella's scent through her excitement about game and through her physical exertion during climb to clearing where baseball field was located created stronger stimulus than casual proximity typically created. Her elevated heart rate and her increased respiration spreading her scent more effectively and creating more intense temptation that tested not only Jasper's control, but tested control of all family members whose vegetarian discipline was being challenged by human, whose appeal was universal, even though Edward's reaction to her was uniquely strong. The constant risk assessment that characterized Edward's internal state during family interactions with Bella involved calculating wind direction to ensure that Bella's scent reached family members in minimal concentration, and involved calculating distance to ensure that escape routes existed, and involved calculating Jasper's thirst level based on when he had last hunted and based on his emotional state that Edward could read through Jasper's thoughts and through Jasper's physical cues that decades of brotherhood had taught Edward to interpret accurately. The exhausting nature of constant vigilance made Edward recognize that loving Bella meant never relaxing and meant never trusting completely even family members he loved, and even family members whose control was typically adequate when unprecedented situation of sustained human presence created unprecedented test of vegetarian discipline. His guilt at putting Bella in danger for selfish desire to integrate her into his life competed with recognition that isolation from family would make relationship unsustainable when his existence was intertwined with family's existence, and when separation from family would require him to choose between Bella and family whose importance to him predated her, and whose bonds were century-old compared to relationship with Bella that was measured in months. The impossible position of wanting both family and Bella, while recognizing that having both meant exposing her to danger from vampires who loved him, but who were still predators, whose nature made them threats regardless of intentions and regardless of affection, they developed for human, who made Edward happy but who tested their control simply through existing in their presence. Carlyle's private conversation with Edward about risk involved gentle observation that Edward was placing enormous faith in family self-control and was asking family members to exercise restraint that went beyond normal vegetarian discipline, when normal vegetarian discipline involved avoiding humans rather than involving sustained proximity to human whose presence in their home and whose presence at family activities created constant temptation that even Carlyle's perfect control found challenging despite centuries of practice. His acknowledgement that love made Edward willing to accept risks that logic suggested were unacceptable created framework for understanding Edward's choices without endorsing those choices as wise or as sustainable when mathematics of probability suggested that sustained exposure would eventually result in failure, regardless of how strong control had been previously. Edward's defensive response, that century of discipline, should enable family to tolerate single human's presence without killing her, represented position that was technically correct, but practically naive, when theory about control differed from reality of control under sustained temptation, and when confidence about restraint was luxury that vegetarian vampires could maintain only through avoiding situations that tested control beyond reasonable limits. His recognition, even during defensive argument, that Carlyle was probably correct, and that bringing Bella into family's private space was probably foolish, did not change his commitment to integration, because alternative of keeping Bella separate from family was emotional isolation that Edward could not tolerate when being with her had become necessary to his continued existence in ways that transcended logic and transcended survival instinct, that suggested distance was safer for everyone involved. The nomadic vampire's arrival during baseball game one evening in late March represented disruption of carefully controlled situation where family's activity had been proceeding safely and where Bella's presence had been managed through strategic positioning and through constant vigilance that Edward maintained throughout game, despite appearance of relaxation, and despite participation in family recreation that normally would be enjoyable but that was transformed into protection duty by human observer whose vulnerability made every moment potential crisis. The three strangers whose approach Alice's visions had not predicted because their decision to investigate thunder sounds had been spontaneous rather than being planned created immediate tension when unknown vampires represented unpredictable variables whose dietary habits were unknown and whose intentions toward Cullen's were unknown and whose reaction to human among vampire family would determine whether situation remained peaceful or whether violence became necessary to protect Bella from nomads whose traditional vampire lifestyle typically included human hunting. Laurent's leadership of Small Coven was evident through his positioning and through his role as spokesman when he called greeting across clearing, his French accent and his courteous demeanor suggesting civilized vampire whose existence included social niceties rather than including only violence and predation that characterized some nomadic vampires whose isolation from vampire society made them feral and made them dangerous beyond normal vampire danger. Victoria's positioning slightly behind Laurent and James's positioning completing triangle suggested pack dynamics where roles were established and where hierarchy existed, despite nomadic lifestyle that suggested independence from traditional coven structures. Their coordination during approach indicating experience traveling together and experience functioning as a unit, whose members trusted each other and whose members supported each other during encounters with other vampires. The wind shift that carried Bella's scent directly across clearing toward nomads created instantaneous change in atmosphere, the casual friendly encounter transforming into tense standoff as 3 nomadic vampires registered human presence among Cullens, and as their hunting instincts activated in response to prey, whose scent reached them and whose availability seemed questionable when humans stood among vampires who presumably were protecting her rather than hunting her. Edward's recognition in James's thoughts of Tracker's instantaneous obsessive focus on Bella represented worst possible outcome, when James's gift for tracking and James's pleasure in challenging hunts made him most dangerous type of vampire to encounter when human needed protection, his nature being specifically optimized for pursuit, and his satisfaction coming from difficulty rather than coming from easy kills that bored him and that provided no intellectual stimulation beyond basic feeding. The protective formation that Cullens immediately assumed with Bella at center represented coordinated response that family had never needed to execute, but that instinct and that family bonds created without discussion and without planning when threat to member triggered collective defensive posture. Edward's positioning directly between James and Bella created primary barrier, his body blocking Tracker's view and his stance communicating willingness to fight despite mathematical disadvantage when 3 against 7 suggested Cullens would win, but when James's tracking abilities and when fight itself would create exposure risk that vegetarian family normally avoided through diplomacy and through avoiding confrontation. Emmett's presence beside Edward represented strength and represented willingness to engage in violence if protection required fighting. His thoughts being focused on strategy and being focused on assessment of opponents' capabilities based on their positioning and based on their physical presentation. Jasper's combat experience from Southern Wars made him most valuable fighter, despite his control being weakest around humans. His strategic mind assessing threats and assessing tactical options, while simultaneously managing his bloodlust around Bella, whose scent was intensified by her fear that her elevated heart rate was broadcasting, and that her rapid breathing was spreading more effectively than her normal scent during calm situations. Alice's visions were cycling through futures rapidly, her precognitive assessment showing branching possibilities where James pursued and where James succeeded in killing Bella, despite family's protection, and showing alternative futures where James lost interest or where James was killed by Cullens, whose protection of human would require lethal force. That vegetarian philosophy typically prevented them from using against other vampires. Carlyle's diplomatic efforts to diffuse situation through explaining that Bella was with them, and through suggesting that nomads continue their travels, represented attempt to avoid violence through negotiation. His calm, authoritative tone establishing that Cullens were not prey and were not weak despite their vegetarian lifestyle, that traditional vampires considered eccentric choice, that reduced their effectiveness and reduced their natural position as apex predators. Laurent's acceptance of situation and Laurent's willingness to depart peacefully suggested he understood that fight over human was not worth antagonizing established coven, whose numbers and whose obvious coordination suggested they would defend their territory and would defend their human regardless of traditional vampire customs that suggested nomadic vampires had equal right to hunt humans whose presence in area made them available prey. James's thoughts revealed different assessment, his tracker instinct recognizing challenge and recognizing that hunt for protected human, would be more satisfying than hunt for unprotected prey, whose capture would be trivial and whose death would be meaningless, when difficulty was what made tracking worthwhile and what made kills satisfying beyond simple feeding. His focus on Bella intensified rather than diminishing. When Edward's protective stance registered as obstacle rather than registering as deterrent, the vampire tracker's nature being stimulated by difficulty and being stimulated by protection that made prey harder to reach and made eventual capture more rewarding when effort required would make success more meaningful. Victoria's support of James was evident through her positioning that shifted to flanking formation, her loyalty to mate overriding pragmatic assessment that suggested pursuing protected human was dangerous and was likely to result in conflict with Cullen's, whose obvious willingness to fight made them poor choice for antagonism. Edward's telepathic monitoring of James's strategy revealed Tracker's immediate planning of pursuit and revealed Tracker's assessment of Cullen's probable protective measures and revealed Tracker's confidence that his tracking abilities would eventually overcome protection when time was on his side and when Cullen's could not maintain perfect vigilance indefinitely, when human needed sleep and needed normal activities that would create opportunities for attack. The recognition that James was more experienced hunter than Edward was protector created terror that exceeded bloodlust and exceeded physical danger to himself when threat to Bella was existential, and when James's century of successful tracking suggested his confidence was justified rather than being arrogance that could be exploited through superior tactics or superior force. The tense departure of nomads after Laurent's diplomatic conclusion of encounter created illusion of resolution that Edward's telepathic access to James's thoughts revealed as false when Tracker was already planning pursuit and was already categorizing Cullen's defensive capabilities and was already identifying Bella's vulnerabilities that protection could not eliminate because human needs and human limitations created opportunities that perfect protection could not close. The drive away from clearing with Bella in Jeep, surrounded by family members whose coordination was perfect and whose commitment to her protection was absolute, provided temporary safety, but provided no long-term solution when James's pursuit would be patient and would be systematic and would exploit any opening that eventual fatigue or eventual distraction created in Cullen's defensive formation. The family strategy session at Cullen House involved rapid planning where multiple approaches were debated and where probability of success for each option was assessed through combination of tactical analysis and Alice's visions that showed outcomes of proposed strategies and showed James's likely responses to Cullen's defensive measures. Edward's frustration and needing help, and at not being able to protect Bella alone, competed with recognition that pride was liability when James's abilities exceeded Edward's abilities, and when family's collective protection was Bella's only chance of survival against Tracker, whose experience and whose gift made him formidable opponent. Jasper's military background made him natural strategist. His proposals involving division of forces and creation of false trails that would confuse Tracker and would buy time for Bella to be moved to location where James could not easily find her. The plan to separate involved Edward leaving with Rosalie and Esme to create false trail toward Forks, while Alice and Jasper took Bella to Phoenix, where James would presumably not think to look, when logical assumption would be that Cullens would keep Bella in their territory, where they had advantage and where they had resources. Edward's agony at separating from Bella exceeded any physical pain he had experienced. His recognition that distance made him unable to protect her personally, and his recognition that trusting siblings with her safety required faith, that his controlling nature made difficult, creating internal conflict between practical necessity and emotional need to maintain proximity. His awareness through Alice's visions that multiple futures showed James succeeding and showed Bella dying before family could prevent Tracker from reaching her, made separation feel like abandonment, even though strategy was sound, and even though Alice's precognitive monitoring provided advantage that James could not counter. The Phoenix Hotel, where Alice and Jasper sequestered Bella, while Edward paced in Seattle, maintaining Fool's Trail, represented torture that exceeded bloodlust and exceeded any temptation when being unable to reach Bella within seconds. If James located her created helplessness, that Edward had never experienced across century of vampire existence, where his capabilities had always been sufficient, and where his speed had always allowed him to reach any location quickly enough to matter. His nightly calls to Alice demanding updates and demanding reassurance that Bella remained safe created ritual that provided minimal comfort when Alice's visions showed branching futures that constantly shifted and constantly showed possibilities, where James succeeded in reaching Bella before family could intercept him. Jasper's frustration at Edward's constant contact was evident through his thoughts that Alice shared. His assessment that Edward's anxiety was undermining mission and was creating distraction that reduced effectiveness of protection when focus needed to be entirely on Bella, rather than being divided between protecting her and managing Edward's emotional state. The phone call that came from Bella's mother's number represented James's successful deception, his theft of Bella's address book, and his impersonation of Renee creating trap that exploited Bella's love for mother and exploited Bella's protective instincts that made her willing to sacrifice herself if sacrifice would save someone she loved. Edward's recognition of deception came too late when Alice's vision of Bella's decision to leave hotel and to meet James alone arrived after Bella had already departed. The time delay between decision and vision being insufficient to prevent action when Alice's gifts sometimes showed futures only moments before they occurred, and when those moments were insufficient to stop determined human, whose stubbornness exceeded her survival instinct and whose courage exceeded her wisdom about facing vampire Tracker alone, without protection and without hope of survival. The race to ballet studio where James had lured Bella represented every nightmare scenario Edward had imagined since recognizing Tracker's interest. His drive at illegal speeds and his desperate calculations about whether he would arrive before James killed Bella, creating panic that overwhelmed rational thought and creating focus that was entirely on reaching her before heart stopped beating and before blood stopped flowing and before life ended in a way that James's thoughts suggested would be brutal and would be prolonged when Tracker's pleasure came from hunt rather than coming from quick kill that would end sport too rapidly. Alice's vision of Bella already in studio and already injured when Edward arrived made every mile feel like eternity and made every second feel like hour when time was finite, and when Bella's survival was measured in minutes that were elapsing while distance remained. The ballet studio's interior, when Edward finally arrived, showed destruction that James had inflicted. The mirrors smashed and the floor scattered with glass, and the blood smell overwhelming, when Bella's blood that Edward had resisted for months was pooled and was fresh and was calling to him with intensity that made immediate feeding response automatic rather than being choice that his discipline could moderate. His visual focus on Bella's broken form lying in blood, with leg bent at wrong angle, and with hand bearing James's bite mark that was injecting venom into her system, created dual crisis where she was dying from injuries and where she was transforming into vampire against her will and against Edward's will, when transformation was outcome. He had been trying to prevent since recognizing that he loved her, and since recognizing that her humanity was precious and should be preserved rather than being destroyed through vampire conversion. The immediate decision between letting her die human or transforming her into vampire represented choice that Edward had hoped never to face. His preference being that Bella live full human life and die natural death decades in future when old age claimed her, rather than dying at 17 from vampire attack, or rather than becoming vampire whose immortality would bind her to him eternally, but would cost her everything that made her human. Carlyle's arrival seconds behind Edward provided medical expertise and provided calm assessment that Bella's injuries were survivable if venom was extracted and if transformation was prevented. His instruction that Edward needed to suck venom from wound represented ultimate test of control when tasting Bella's blood while stopping before her heart stopped, required discipline that exceeded anything Edward had demonstrated and required trust that he could override feeding instinct that her blood would trigger. The act of placing his mouth on her wrist and drawing venom from wound meant tasting blood he had fantasized about and resisted for months. The reality of her blood on his tongue exceeding every imagination and exceeding every fantasy when flavor and satisfaction were beyond anything animal blood provided and were beyond anything he had anticipated despite knowing intellectually that her blood would be appealing. The war between desire to drain her completely and desperate need to save her life represented battle between vampire nature and human love. His instinct demanding he continue feeding until heart stopped and until blood was consumed entirely, while his conscious mind screamed that stopping was necessary and that her survival mattered more than satisfaction that her blood provided. Carlyle's voice cutting through bloodlust with command that her blood was clean and that venom was extracted represented external authority that Edward's internal discipline could not provide. His father's medical assessment that continuing to drink would kill her rather than save her, giving Edward justification to stop when stopping felt impossible and when every instinct demanded he continue. The agony of pulling away from her wrist when blood remained and when feeding could continue represented physical pain that exceeded transformation burning. His body's demands for continuation of feeding being overridden through sheer will and through recognition that killing Bella would destroy him more completely than any torture and would end his existence meaningfully, even if his body continued functioning when purpose would be gone and when meaning would be eliminated through murder of person whose life had given his immortal existence first genuine purpose beyond simply existing. Edward's reluctance about Bella's 18th birthday party in September of 2 1006 exceeded normal introvert discomfort with celebrations. His awareness that gathering of vampires around human, whose blood was appealing, and whose paper-thin skin made bleeding accidents probable, created situation where risk outweighed benefit, and where Alice's enthusiasm for party planning was overriding practical safety considerations that Edward's protective paranoia insisted should take precedence over social niceties and over celebration of milestone that marked Bella's transition into legal adulthood. His arguments against party had been overruled by Alice, whose visions showed successful celebration and whose determination to create normal human experience for Bella made her dismiss Edward's concerns as excessive worry that his century of catastrophizing had trained him to experience, but that probability suggested was unwarranted when family's control was strong, and when brief party in controlled environment posed minimal danger compared to daily biology class exposure that had been managed successfully across months. The Cullen house preparation involved Alice's elaborate decorating and involved Esme's cooking of human food that vampires would not eat, but that appearance of normal birthday party required, when Bella's human friends might hear about celebration and might question why party involved no refreshments and involved no normal elements that teenage birthday parties typically included. Edward's hypervigilance during setup involved monitoring every family member's emotional state and involved assessing every potential danger source from candles that could cause burns to glass decorations, that could shatter into sharp fragments, that could cut Bella's skin, and could create bleeding that would test control that Edward trusted intellectually, but feared practically when bloodlust was involuntary response. That discipline could moderate but could not eliminate entirely, regardless of how many years of vegetarian practice had been accumulated. Bella's arrival at party created immediate spike in Edward's anxiety. Her discomfort with being center of attention and her obvious wish to be anywhere else making him regret allowing Alice to organize celebration that Bella had not wanted, and that Edward had known would make her uncomfortable, but that he had permitted because denying Alice was difficult, and because his sister's joy in party planning had seemed harmless, until moment when Bella's presence among vampires made theoretical danger feel immediately real. Her paper cut while opening gift from Carlyle and Esme represented instantaneous transformation of safe celebration into life-threatening crisis. The single drop of blood that welled from her finger creating scent that filled room and that triggered automatic response in Jasper, whose control was weakest and whose decades of human hunting made bloodlust more powerful than vegetarian discipline. When his newborn army experience and his Southern Wars experience had involved constant feeding and had involved violence that was recent enough in memory to override years of Cullen family vegetarianism, Jasper's attack was pure instinct without thought, his body moving toward Bella with speed and with single-minded focus that his conscious mind had no opportunity to moderate or to prevent, when vampire nature responded to blood scent before rational thought could engage and before recognition that Bella was family friend, rather than being prey could prevent hunting response that centuries of vampire existence had hardwired into automatic reaction. Edward's intervention required throwing Bella backward across room to create distance between her and Jasper. His calculation in microsecond being that injury from impact with wall and with glass table was preferable to death from Jasper's attack, when broken bones and lacerations were survivable, but exsanguination from vampire feeding was fatal and was irreversible once begun, because stopping mid-feed was nearly impossible for a vampire whose control was already compromised. The sound of Bella's body hitting glass, and the sound of glass shattering, and the sight of blood now flowing from multiple cuts, rather than from single paper cut, created a worst possible scenario where protecting her from Jasper had injured her more severely and had created more blood scent that intensified temptation for all family members whose control was being tested beyond normal limits when fresh human blood in concentrated amount was different stimulus than Bella's normal scent that they had habituated to across months of exposure. Edward's physical restraint of Jasper required force that Brotherhood made painful. His arms wrapping around Brother, whose struggling was desperate attempt to reach prey, that instinct identified as food source, and that rational mind had temporarily stopped recognizing as person deserving protection, rather than being target deserving attack. Emmett's assistance in restraining Jasper was necessary because Jasper's strength during bloodlust exceeded Edward's ability to control alone. The combined force of two brothers being required to prevent third brother from breaking free and from reaching Bella, whose blood was pooling on floor and whose consciousness was wavering from shock and from pain that injuries were creating. The awareness that Jasper was not choosing attack and was not morally responsible for instinct that vampire nature created did not eliminate Edward's rage at Brother, whose loss of control had nearly killed Bella, and whose continued struggling suggested that reasoning with him was impossible when bloodlust had overwhelmed cognitive function and had reduced him to pure predator, whose only thought was feeding, and whose only goal was reaching prey, whose scent dominated his awareness. Carlyle's calm treatment of Bella's wounds, while family members either restrained Jasper or removed themselves from room to avoid adding to danger, represented professional medical competence that Edward had witnessed countless times, but that had never felt so crucial when Bella's survival depended on Father's steady hands and on Father's perfect control around blood that would overwhelm lesser vampires' discipline, regardless of how many years they had practiced vegetarian lifestyle. His stitching of deeper cuts and his cleaning of glass fragments from wounds was performed with efficiency that suggested decades of emergency room experience, his conversation with Bella being designed to keep her calm and to distract her from pain that human pain medications could not adequately address when vampire venom in Carlyle's system meant he could not safely donate blood for transfusion, and when hospital treatment would require explanations about how injuries occurred that would create questions about family dynamics and about safety of environment. The cleanup after Jasper's removal from house involved Alice's tearful apologies and involved Rosalie's vindicated anger that Edward's choice to involve Bella in family life had resulted in exactly type of disaster that Rosalie had predicted and that Rosalie had warned against when her arguments about danger had been dismissed as jealousy, rather than being recognized as legitimate concern about inevitable accident that probability suggested would occur eventually, when sustained exposure to human created countless opportunities for control failure. Edward's recognition that Rosalie had been correct and that bringing Bella into vampire world was condemning her to death, whether immediate or eventual, made him unable to defend his choices or to argue against her assessment that his selfishness was endangering Bella and was endangering family, whose exposure through accident would bring Volturi attention and would bring ancient vampires' judgment about vegetarian Coven, whose experiment in coexisting with humans had failed spectacularly. His observation of Bella's pale face and Bella's obvious pain and Bella's blood-stained clothing while Carlyle worked created crystallization of understanding that this scenario would repeat and would eventually result in her death when next accident might occur, when Carlyle was not present, or when control failure involved multiple family members whose collective bloodlust would overwhelm even Edward's protective capabilities. The mathematics of probability that Edward had been avoiding through optimism and through faith in family's discipline revealed themselves as undeniable when sustained exposure created countless opportunities for accidents and created countless moments where control could fail, and where failure would be fatal regardless of how many previous successes had been achieved. The car ride taking Bella home from party that had become disaster involved silence that was heavy with Edward's recognition that continuing relationship was murder through negligence, his awareness that loving her meant exposing her to constant danger from himself and from family, whose vegetarian lifestyle was choice rather than being guarantee, and whose perfect control until tonight had created false confidence that tonight's near tragedy had shattered irreparably. His decision forming during drive was that separation was only moral choice, when alternative was waiting for next accident and waiting for next control failure and waiting for Bella's inevitable death from exposure to vampires whose nature made them lethal. Regardless of intentions and regardless of affection, they felt for human, whose presence in their lives was luxury they could not afford when cost would eventually be her life. Alice's visions during following days showed futures where Edward left and futures where relationship continued, the branching possibilities revealing that his choice would determine trajectory and would determine whether Bella survived to old age or whether Bella died young from vampire-related incident that could be accident or could be attack from enemy who recognize her as Edward's vulnerability and as target whose death would hurt him more than his own destruction would hurt him. Her precognitive monitoring showed that leaving would devastate Bella and showed that staying would eventually kill Bella. The impossible choice between her emotional well-being and her physical survival, creating certainty that physical survival was paramount. When emotional devastation could heal across years, but death was permanent and was irreversible. Jasper's devastation and his decision to leave with Alice represented consequence that Edward's choice to involve Bella in family had created, his brother's shame at control failure, and his brother's recognition that he could not remain near Bella without risking repeat of attack, making him choose exile over continued proximity to human, whose blood had proven too tempting for his weakened discipline to resist. Edward's guilt at causing Jasper's self-imposed exile competed with recognition that Jasper's departure was wise choice when his control around Bella was demonstrably inadequate and when his presence created danger that family could not accept and that Bella's survival could not accommodate. The family discussion about whether Edward should leave involved Carlyle's understanding, but not disagreement with Edward's logic. His father's recognition that probability mathematics suggested eventual fatal accident, made argument against Edward's decision impossible when caring about Bella's survival, meant accepting that Edward's presence in her life was death sentence, whose execution was delayed but was inevitable unless separation occurred. Rosalie's agreement was immediate and was emphatic, her position being that Edward should have left months ago and that continuing relationship had been selfish choice that prioritized his happiness over Bella's safety, when protection required distance, and when love required letting go, regardless of how painful separation would be for both parties. Emmett's reluctant agreement reflected his recognition that brother's happiness was important, but human life was more important when choosing between Edward's emotional well-being and Bella's physical survival, made moral calculations simple, even though emotional cost would be devastating. Esme's heartbreak at losing Bella from family was evident through her thoughts that Edward read. Her maternal love for human girl who had brought light into Edward's existence, making her wish that alternative solution existed, but making her unable to argue against Edward's assessment that probability of fatal accident was approaching certainty when sustained exposure created too many opportunities for tragedy. Her acknowledgement that she loved Bella but could not argue with mathematics that suggested Bella's death was inevitable if relationship continued represented painful acceptance that sometimes love meant releasing rather than holding, and that Edward's choice to leave was sacrifice motivated by genuine care rather than being abandonment motivated by selfishness or by loss of interest. The preparation for leaving involved Edward's planning of cruelest kindness, his recognition that making Bella believe he did not love her would make separation easier for her and would make her recovery faster, when believing she had been abandoned for legitimate reasons would allow her to be angry rather than being devastated, and would allow her to move forward with human life that was appropriate for her, rather than remaining fixated on vampire whose continued presence would eventually kill her. His rehearsal of lies designed to convince her that relationship had been temporary curiosity satisfied rather than being eternal love created self-loathing that exceeded any self-hatred he had experienced when lying to person he loved. Most felt like betrayal, but felt necessary when truth would make her fight separation and would make her argue for continuing relationship whose continuation would be her death warrant. His certainty that he was making correct choice competed with awareness that choice would destroy them both emotionally, even though physical destruction would be prevented through distance that would keep her safe from him and would keep her safe from family, whose love for her could not override nature that made them dangerous and that made coexistence impossible, when her mortality and her fragility created vulnerability. That vampire strength and vampire instinct would eventually exploit through accident or through moment of weakness that discipline could not prevent indefinitely. The forest path Edward chose for ending relationship with Bella was deliberate selection of location that held meaning from their early courtship, and that held privacy that would prevent witnesses from observing her heartbreak, and that would prevent Charlie from intervening before Edward could complete task of convincing her that separation was permanent and that future together was illusion, that temporary infatuation had created, but that reality could not sustain. His positioning at clearing where trees created natural amphitheater and where afternoon light filtered through canopy, creating atmosphere that should be peaceful but that felt heavy. with impending loss represented careful staging of scene, where he would destroy happiness of person he loved most in order to preserve her life, that his continued presence threatened through constant exposure to danger that probability suggested would eventually prove fatal. The rehearsed lies that Edward delivered with conviction that was necessary to make Bella believe them involved claims that were partially true, but were fundamentally dishonest in their framing. His statement that she did not belong in his world being accurate assessment of danger, but being presented as rejection based on her inadequacy, rather than being presented as protection based on his nature. His insistence that relationship had been distraction and had been curiosity. Satisfied represented inversion of truth when reality was that Bella had become center of his existence and had become only source of meaning. His century of vampire life had provided beyond family bonds and beyond vegetarian philosophy that felt empty compared to connection he felt with human, whose mortality made every moment precious and made every interaction significant. His claim that she was merely human and that he had grown bored with limitations that her humanity imposed created framework where separation was his choice based on her insufficiency rather than being his sacrifice based on his danger to her. The lie had been designed to wound her pride and to wound her self-worth in ways that would make her angry rather than making her devastated, when anger would facilitate her moving forward with human life while devastation would trap her in grief that could consume years of finite human existence. His awareness of her heartbreak through observation of her breathing that became ragged, and through observation of her physical collapse when knees buckled and when she sank to forest floor, created guilt that was overwhelming. But that was necessary cost of protection when short-term emotional damage was preferable to long-term physical death that his presence would eventually cause. The cruelty required to maintain lies while watching her suffer exceeded any torture Edward had experienced. His century of existence having never included moment where causing pain to someone he loved was necessary and was intentional and was designed to maximize damage in order to achieve goal of making separation permanent rather than making separation temporary pause that she might hope to reverse through persistence or through changing herself in ways that would supposedly make her adequate for vampire world. His command that she not do anything reckless represented final protection, when his awareness of her depression and his awareness of her self-destructive tendencies made him fear that separation might trigger dangerous behavior that could injure her or could kill her, when his leaving was supposed to preserve her life rather than being supposed to end her life through despair. His promise that it would be as if he never existed represented commitment to erasing evidence of his presence from her life. His instruction to family that they would leave no trace and would remove all photographs and would remove all gifts and would eliminate all physical reminders of relationship, whose memory would remain, but whose evidence would be eliminated, to facilitate her moving forward without constant visual triggers that would refresh pain and would prevent healing. The finality in his tone and the coldness in his expression that he forced himself to maintain despite internal agony created performance that was convincing because it needed to be convincing when Bella's acceptance of separation depended on her belief that his feelings had changed and that relationship had meant less to him than it had meant to her. The family's midnight departure from Forks involved abandoning home that Esme had designed and had built, and involved abandoning life they had established in community where they had been accepted and where they had been comfortable. The cost of Edward's relationship with Bella being measured not only in his personal suffering, but in family's displacement and in disruption of stability that relocation always created, regardless of how many times they had moved and regardless of how practiced they were at establishing new identities in new locations. His instruction that evidence of their existence be eliminated completely involved removing yearbook photographs and involved compelling school administrators to alter records and involved erasing digital footprints that modern technology created and that previous relocations had not needed to address when internet and when social media made disappearing more complicated than it had been in previous decades. His monitoring of Bella from distance through Alice's visions showed catatonic depression that exceeded what Edward had anticipated. Her zombie-like existence and her mechanical performance of daily activities without engagement or without apparent awareness, creating guilt that was proportional to suffering. He was witnessing and creating doubt about whether his choice had been correct, when emotional damage he was causing seemed to approach severity of physical danger he was preventing. The months of her depression that Alice's visions showed him involved Bella sitting in chair in her bedroom, staring at wall for hours without moving and without responding to Charlie's attempts at conversation. Her complete withdrawal from life representing trauma response that Edward recognized, but that he had not predicted would be so complete, or would be so prolonged when his assumption had been that her youth and her resilience would facilitate faster recovery. His own suicidal depression mirroring hers represented shared suffering across distance, his existence becoming mechanical performance of necessary activities without engagement and without purpose, when reason for continuing to exist had been removed through his own choice and through his commitment to her safety that required his absence from her life. His refusal of family's comfort and his refusal to hunt properly created self-punishment that was proportional to guilt he felt about causing Bella's suffering. His awareness that he had destroyed her happiness in order to save her life, creating impossible emotional equation where correct choice felt wrong and where protection felt like cruelty, when outcomes he was witnessing through Alice's visions suggested that emotional death was approaching physical death in severity and impermanence. His drift toward recklessness during months of separation involved seeking danger and seeking situations where his vampire nature would be tested and where his survival would be uncertain. His death wish being clear to family, whose concern about his mental state was evident through their thoughts that Edward read, and through their attempts to engage him that Edward rebuffed, because accepting comfort felt like betrayal of suffering he deserved for causing Bella's pain. Carlyle's awareness that Edward was planning suicide by Volturi represented father's worst fear, his recognition that son's depression had progressed beyond simple grief into active death, wish that would manifest through provoking ancient vampires whose power and whose authority made them capable of destroying even gifted vampire whose telepathy and whose speed would be insufficient against guard whose combined abilities and whose overwhelming numbers made resistance futile. The certainty that he had made correct choice even as it destroyed them both represented Edward's commitment to Bella's physical survival over their mutual emotional well-being. his recognition that living without her was unbearable, but that her death would be unforgivable, creating stalemate where continuing to exist felt pointless, but seeking death felt selfish. When Bella's safety might still require his intervention, and when his continued existence represented insurance policy against threats that might materialize and that might require his protection despite distance and despite separation. The logical impossibility of his position created paralysis, where he could not be with her because proximity endangered her, and could not stop existing while she lived, because she might need him, and could not seek death, because doing so was abandoning responsibility to protect her from distance. His continued monitoring through Alice represented only connection he allowed himself. His sister's visions providing window into Bella's life that was painful to observe, but that was necessary to maintain when knowing she was physically safe, even if emotionally devastated, provided minimal comfort, and provided justification for choice that was destroying them both. His awareness of Jacob Black's presence in Bella's life created gratitude mixed with jealousy. His recognition that Werewolf was providing comfort and was providing friendship that helped Bella function, creating appreciation for someone who could give her what Edward could not give her, which was companionship without danger, and was presence without constant threat of death that vampire nature created regardless of intentions or regardless of discipline. His knowledge that she was safer without him, and his belief that she was better off without him, and his hope that she was healing without him, competed with evidence that Alice's visions provided, showing that none of those statements were true when Bella's safety from vampire threats was purchased at cost of her mental health, and when her supposed improvement was actually deterioration masked by performance for Charlie's benefit. His disbelief in healing competed with commitment to separation, when reversing choice would mean admitting that sacrifice had been pointless, and would mean accepting that causing mutual suffering had achieved nothing, except proving that love was insufficient reason to overcome danger that nature created. The moment Alice's visions went dark represented crisis that exceeded normal concern. Bella's future disappearing from Alice's precognitive sight, meaning that either Bella had died or that Bella's decisions were being influenced by werewolves whose presence created blind spots in Alice's visions, when their nature somehow interfered with her gift's ability to see futures that involved them. Edward's interpretation based on Alice's last vision showing Bella jumping from cliff was that Bella had committed suicide. His certainty that she had killed herself, creating immediate collapse of every rationalization and every justification for leaving when protection had failed, and when distance had not prevented her death, but had simply meant that he was not present to save her from herself and from depression that his abandonment had created. His immediate decision that living without Bella in world was impossible represented final surrender to death, wish that had been building across months of separation. His recognition that existence without her alive somewhere was unbearable and was pointless, making continuation seem masochistic when purpose had been eliminated and when meaning had been destroyed through her death. The plan to provoke Volturi into destroying him was calculated and was certain. His awareness that Ara would grant death request if provocation was sufficient, making suicide by ancient vampire preferable to continued existence that had lost all meaning and that had lost all purpose, when Bella's safety had been his reason for living, and when her death eliminated that reason permanently, the awareness that seeking death would devastate family whose love for him was genuine and whose bonds with him were century-old created guilt but did not create deterrence. His recognition that his continued existence would be burden to family whose concern for his mental state was already exhausting them and whose happiness was being compromised by his depression, making his death seem like relief for everyone, rather than seeming like tragedy when living without purpose was suffering that benefited no one. His trip to Volterra with intention of revealing himself in public square during festival represented commitment to exposure that would force Volturi's hand and would force their destruction of vampire who violated fundamental law about secrecy when alternatives, like simply asking for death, would be refused because Aro valued gifted vampires and would attempt to recruit rather than destroy if requests came without violation that demanded enforcement. Alice's frantic intervention claiming Bella was alive represented hope that Edward could not fully accept. His fear that Alice was wrong or that Bella would die before he could reach her, creating desperate urgency that was mixture of hope and terror, when possibility that she lived competed with certainty that she had died, and when trust in Alice's visions competed with evidence that her visions had been wrong before and could be wrong now. His disbelief and his need for confirmation and his terror that hope was false created emotional state that was unstable and was dangerous when his commitment to seeing Bella one final time before accepting death or accepting life depending on whether she actually survived was absolute and was overwhelming every other consideration, including family's concerns and including rational assessment of whether reunion would help or would harm when his presence had caused her suffering and when his return might trigger relapse into depression. That separation had supposedly been designed to cure. And so Edward's most terrifying moments were never about external threats or ancient vampires seeking his destruction, but were about his own nature and his capacity to harm and his loss of control when loving Bella Swan meant constant awareness that he was predator, whose restraint was choice rather than being guarantee, and whose discipline could fail during single instant of weakness that would transform century of vegetarian philosophy into murder that would destroy them both. The irony that century-old vampires' greatest fears were tied entirely to fragile human girl, whose mortality made every moment precious and every interaction dangerous, created recognition that terror came from love rather than coming from hate. When caring about someone made him vulnerable in ways that immortality could not protect against, and when attachment created weakness that enemies could exploit, and that his own nature could betray. The pattern of his fears revealed progression from bloodlust to exposure to inadequate protection to family danger to forced separation to suicidal despair, each terror being manifestation of love that made him more dangerous rather than less dangerous, when protection triggered violence and when devotion triggered obsession that transcended rational behavior. His darkest moments revealed humanity more than his century of civilized existence revealed humanity. His capacity for obsession and his capacity for self-destruction and his capacity for cruel kindness, demonstrating that Monster was not simply vampire nature, but was his willingness to destroy happiness in pursuit of safety that might be illusion. Rest now, carried by Edward's fears and his fierce protection. Let his darkness and his devotion ease you into sleep. Sleep well, gentle souls. Good night.